is Tony Mensing, and he's a field ag engineer, and he's going to be talking about manure management on a small farm. And I'll let him do more introduction of himself. And I want to welcome everybody back to our series.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to participate, and looks like maybe small but mighty crowd tonight. So I have some information I'll go through and share, and I'm happy to take questions. Also, I know virtual format like this is challenged sometimes on the questions, but typically I try and be fairly informal. So if you have something as I'm going through my presentation, don't be afraid to shout it out. And I think I'm gonna have some help monitoring the chat, so we can hopefully either get questions or get a list of questions that need answered. So yeah, we're here for manure management on small and beginning farms. And as you heard already, my name is Tony Mensing, and I'm the field ag engineer in Southwest Iowa. So I cover 20 counties over here in the southwest corner of the state. So I've been lucky enough to be with Extension for not quite a couple years yet, but a little bit about my background, I guess, before we get into the fun that manure is. So I've been with Extension not quite a couple years, but I've been around longer than that. So been in ag engineering or ag business some way, shape, or form for longer than I feel like it should be, over 16 years already somehow. So got my ag engineering degree from Iowa State. Was an engineer in a couple different capacities in private industry for several years. I was a design engineer or agricultural engineer with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service in one of their area offices here in Iowa for about 6 years. Then also did a stint in ag finance and lending in the private sector. So I have kind of a varied background, but a lot of pieces that fit lots of different ag related things. It seems like everybody in ag is a person that is required to do lots of different things. So it's hard to be a specialist. Got to be a specialist and a generalist. So have some background in lots of different areas there. So and I don't know what everybody's background is as far as where you're at with manure management in your farm operations, or if you're both feed in already, or if we're just exploring some stuff. But I still am involved in some production ag. So grew up on a farm here in Iowa, and still am involved in production ag on everybody's scale of small to large is different, but I would say a relatively small farm. But we do typically traditional row crops and some cattle production. So, and then got on the screen there, the picture of my favorite crop is our next generation of Iowans that we're trying to grow up here too. So that's a little bit about my background, and then we'll get into manure management. I guess I'm going to kind of just work my way through from pretty basic up, and then we can see where that takes us, I guess. But all the way to what is manure, kind of at the basic level. And I think probably in general, people have a good understanding of what they're thinking of, but that doesn't always mean the same thing to everybody else. So, and since we're talking manure management, what is management in this respect, I guess, right? So somebody has to be the COO of POO, right? So somebody has to be in charge of that, or some buddies have to be in charge of that. So what does that mean, kind of, as we're thinking through manure management on a small farm, or any farm for that matter, I guess, really. We'll take a little bit of a look at manure and thinking through that as it would be a waste product. So your opinion on whether it is or is not may be indifferent, or you may be one way or the other, but in some respects it is a waste product, and we'll just take a little bit of a look at why that may be, or how that may be, and what that may mean to some of our decision making as we're thinking about how to deal with it, right? So the other side of that coin is if we want to evaluate the manure and think of it more in the respect of being a resource or a co-product of our livestock enterprise. So something that we get in addition to our main crop of whatever we're trying to grow livestock wise, but is still a resource, not truly just a waste product for us. So what is manure? So essentially it's livestock excrement, right? So feces and urine. At the basic form, that's what it is. So that can still be a lot of different things, and we'll touch on that some more in what that may mean, being lots of different things. But that is essentially manure is the excrement from the critters. So it may end up being mixed with bedding, spilled, wasted feedstuffs, wash water, egg wash water, dairy parlor water, lots of different things, but basically the livestock excrement, and then whatever else may come from our livestock production facility that gets mixed or commingled with that manure. So then my last bullet point there is something that we don't always give a lot of credit to, but is an important piece of the puzzle to keep in mind. So if we're thinking through what is livestock manure, what we covered already is kind of the true basis of what that may be, but also it's anytime that we get some water, clean water, we'll say, that's running through our facility or into our facility, whether it's the animal production area or the manure storage area, if we're getting that commingling of the clean water with our manure stuffs, then that clean water is part of our manure now also, right? So we can do some different things from a management and engineering perspective to try to minimize or eliminate that so that we aren't dealing with unnecessary volumes of what used to be clean water. And a lot of times that is something that we try to do to help reduce the workload of dealing with the manure, but it is something that deserves some thought as you're trying to decipher how your system works and how you would like it to work, right? So if we don't let that clean water commingle with our manure or our dirty water, then we don't have to deal with it like we do the rest of the manure, right? So also it doesn't dilute the nutrients if our goal is maybe a little bit more resource oriented as far as how we're going to utilize that manure. So still on what is manure. So maybe everybody on is well aware, but manure, a significant part of manure is truly water. So regardless of letting any clean water into our system, manures are made up largely of water. So it depends on the circumstances, obviously, and the type of critter and all of the things that play a part in that. But lots of manures are on the over 50% moisture side of the realm. So even stackable manures that we think of and handle as a solid are over 50% moisture in lots of cases. So and that kind of makes sense if we think through. So my background is more traditional beef cattle type production and the larger critters of that nature. Not as much on some of the other critters, but in general, if we think through, regardless of what they are, how much water they drink, that water goes somewhere, right? So it doesn't all get perspirated or otherwise lost to the atmosphere. A lot of it ends up in the manure, right? So on a beef cow type scenario, we could be looking at 20-25 gallons on a hot summer day of water intake. So if we think through where all that water goes, it makes sense that we would end up with a lot of moisture in the manure also. So and the picture there, those are just some samples, not anything specific to how much moisture there is, but just another indicator that there is truly a lot of water in manure. So water in general is, I like to tell people that that's the root of lots of engineering problems, right? Either we have too much or too little, or it's in the wrong place. So water drives a lot of things, and manure included. Still on what it is. So can be kind of various different states. So we can handle it as a liquid. It can be handled as a solid. And if I throw slurry in there, that's maybe somewhere kind of in between, right? So if we're thinking about the liquid, the image there maybe doesn't fit what I would consider, generally speaking, a small farm scenario, but it's a good representation of how we may handle a liquid manure, right? So it's pumpable. It flows under pressure. We put it in this tanker with a pump like you would pump a liquid. It's not all water, obviously, but it moves, can be moved and transported more like water than like a stackable solid, right? So and the slurry is probably a better description in general for most manures that get handled as a liquid. If we do some solid separation or some of those things, we may get more of a true liquid with less solids, and it may handle more like a true liquid than a slurry. But that gets to be a little bit of a gray, fuzzy area on where you draw the line there. So this is actually a excerpt from the Midwest Plan Service 18, and it's got some age on it now, but has some good information as far as manure characteristics. So not an extensive list here necessarily, but if you can read on the screen there, we have swine, poultry, beef, cattle, and dairy cows. And if you look here, the left hand of the chart is 0% solid, so that would be all water. And then over here, almost at the right side, is 30% solid. So we're still well over half liquid. And each of those species has a mark on there for kind of how it would come straight out of the animal if you were going to evaluate that. So swine, 90% moisture, 10% solids, right? So, and then the poultry is kind of the one that lies a little further down the more solid line there. So 75% moisture, 25% solids on that. And that's still a lot of water in relative terms, but generally that poultry manure gets handled as a stackable solid, right? So there's a lot of water there, but because of the solids that are in it, it behaves more like a solid on the whole basis. So and these manures can get manipulated to be different than their as excreted state, right? So some of that happens naturally depending on the environment and our housing situation and those kind of things. Sometimes we may manipulate that in order to be able to handle it different, right? So some swine manures on lots of different scale farms may be handled as a liquid. It also may be in this area kind of that slurry liquid type state as excreted, and may get mixed with a bedding, which would allow us to handle it more like a solid, right? So we increase the solids content, make it less water on a percentage basis, and then it's something that we can handle as a solid with solid handling equipment. So just kind of, I think, good general information that maybe manure isn't always as it appears. So I think sometimes we think it's a lot of dry matter, and it is maybe relatively, but is still a lot of water. So obviously all manures are not created equal, right? So we just saw the chart. Species can play a part in what those characteristics are. That chart didn't break it down beyond species necessarily, but you can still get a wide variety in manure characteristics just based on where those critters are in their life cycle, right? So a dairy calf, for example, would not have the same production, for one thing, and would not have the same actual manure characteristics. The stuff that makes up that manure is not going to be the same in the same proportions necessarily as a mature milking dairy cow, and she may not be the same as a dry dairy cow, right? So there's lots of factors that affect that, but kind of my point here is that one manure is not the same as another manure, even down to if we say swine manure. Well, there's lots of different swine manures, right? So are we talking feeder pigs, or are we talking finisher pigs, or sows, right? So there can be lots of differences in what we are getting, and in a small farm setting, we may get lots of those different manures throughout a production cycle, right? So if we're not only raising the turkeys to finish, or if we're not only finishing some swine, if we got the whole production cycle in there, we're going to get lots more variation in what type of manure we get to deal with, right? So environmental factors, and I already mentioned this, but they can play a huge part, right? So our air humidity changes a lot throughout the year. That can change the manure characteristics significantly. Also, depending on what type of housing we might have for those critters, if it's an under roof situation is a lot different than say a pasture situation, which intuitively makes sense, but is something that is worth noting, that all of those differences can have a significant impact on what kind of manure we're going to have to deal with, not only from the how we handle it characteristic, but what it actually is made up of, right? So if we think about say a beef cow operation, a pasture situation, and the manure that is generated there is not going to be the same as the manure that's generated in a say a smaller earthen lot where we may finish some calves to fatten, right? So if we have an earthen lot, we're probably getting a lot more manure mixed with some of that earthen surface of the lot if we're cleaning that up, versus the pasture situation where we don't have as much mixing, and we are hopefully not pastured to a point where we have a concentration of manure that requires us to go into that pasture and truly clean it up and do something else with it. So hopefully those critters are spreading that manure in a pasture situation kind of themselves, right? So different manures, different ways that it gets dealt with. One other point, and I may have touched on this already, but what we're feeding those critters can have a significant impact also. So we'll get into a little bit about some nutrients and why that matters, but it makes sense that what we feed them is going to impact the excrement that comes out, right? So if we feed a high sulfur type diet for whatever reason, then that would change the characteristics, could change the characteristics of the manure versus a diet that is low in sulfur, for example. So and I'm not a nutritionist by any means, but I do know that there are things that have an impact on the bigger scale swine side of things. Phosphorus content in manure has changed somewhat over the past not too terrible many years, because there's been a shift in larger scale swine feed rations. So that changes on that scale, and it doesn't matter whether it's a large scale farm or a small scale farm. What the point is that the feed impacts what we get out the other end. So just something to keep in mind, and that doesn't mean that one way is right and one way is wrong. It's just that the more we should be a little bit conscientious of, if we make a change on one side, that it may have an impact somewhere else. So then we get into what is management a little bit, and I'm sure that amongst the people on the webinar, there's somebody that's much better manager than I am. But management, kind of in its simplest form, talk about administration, organization, running something, supervision, control. So we're thinking about manure management, somebody is in charge of dealing with that manure one way, shape, or form, right? So that's kind of what it amounts to. So if we're thinking about what are we going to do with that, or what impact does it have, or do we need to do anything with it, those are management decisions, right? So again, somebody's in charge of it is kind of where I'm going with that. And kind of by default, I guess it doesn't have to be somebody, but if you're in a livestock production setting, small farm or not, we're getting some manure from those critters. So somebody's making a decision, either consciously or not, of how we deal with that, right? So even if we don't deal with it, the decision then was that we chose not to deal with it. Probably try to plan ahead and anticipate problems. So the good news here is that there are some tools and there's some information, and it's not all an exact science necessarily. There's some art and there's some other things that factor into how we manage our manure. But if we kind of can plan ahead, like most things, we probably get ahead of the curve a little bit, right? So as a manager, you may also end up in a situation where you need to be reactive. If we have a manure storage situation, whether that be a simple stockpile or maybe we're storing under a barn roof where we're housing the critters, that's a legitimate storage area. We may get a situation where our storage is full and we need to now decide how we're going to deal with that, right? So we didn't necessarily get ahead of the curve, or something changed, or maybe we had a water leak or other type of things that are out of our control to some extent that affect how we're going to have to deal with that manure. We don't always get a plan ahead. Sometimes we have to be a little bit reactive. So hopefully, though, we can make some educated decisions on how we deal with that and be cognizant of what effects it might have for us and our neighbors and the rest of the folks that get to enjoy our great green earth, and also how it impacts the rest of our small farm, right? So yeah, if we can be a little bit educated in our options and what things we're trying to achieve, then hopefully we can make a better decision in how we deal with that, either in a planning stage for something that we haven't had to deal with yet, or in the reactive stage if we say have that problem that needs addressed, right? So okay, so in order to be able to make a well-educated or informed decision, managers need information, right? So that seems, I think, hopefully fairly straightforward. The next piece of the puzzle here is it's hard to fix a problem or meet a goal if we don't understand what the problem or goal is, right? So manure seems simple, and in some respects it is, but if we don't know what our goal is, it's hard to be able to meet the objective of our management style, right? So our management plan. What are we trying to do from that management standpoint as far as manure goes? So we get in a little bit then to are we really just truly trying to get rid of the waste, so to speak? So that's one goal, that may be one objective, and that's a legitimate answer for what is our goal in some circumstances. So that doesn't release anybody of the requirement to still follow some good practices, and there are some laws that apply regardless. But our answer may be we just need rid of this manure because it's in the way to do what we need to do with the rest of our small farm production system, right? So we may look at that and say, well, our goal is to use that manure as a resource. So we know there's some potential benefit there, and we want to capture that and get all the goodie we can out of this co-product. So, and I would tend to think that my typical engineer answer for a lot of things is, well, it depends, right? So do you say, well, is it a waste product or is it a resource? Well, it kind of depends. And probably a lot of times we end up in some gray area between those two. So in some respects, we just need it gone so that we can maintain our production system on our small farm. But we also would like to have it gone, but be able to use that resource, right? So, and not everybody's farm is going to be the same. So, even if we're all turkey growers, we may not have the same specific goals when it comes to manure management, just like we may not have the same specific goals when it comes to the production side of things, right? So, not every farm is the same, despite there being some similarities along the path. So, each manager needs to be able to think through what their goals are that fit their farm. So, if we're looking at it kind of like a waste, that's, like I mentioned before, that's a legitimate answer for what we have and what we're trying to deal with. So, if it's piling up and it's in the way and we don't know what we're going to do with it because we're using up our production area to store it till we can apply it, or till we can have somebody else deal with it, or till we can get rid of it in some way, shape, or form, it probably really looks like a waste, right? It's hard to look at that, be in your way, and think, well, there's a good resource there. So, it may well be a waste product at that point. Something else, and in the small farms realm, could be lots of different critters and lots of different production scales. But excuse me, something that may make a big difference in how we look at that and whether or not it looks more like a waste product to us is how much there is to deal with, right? So if there's not as much in relative terms from, say, small critters, it may not be as much of a in the way waste product. If we're in a, say, a beef production standpoint, or dairy, or some bigger critters that have more production of that manure, it may look a lot more like a waste product to us. So just purely from the amount that gets generated and then therefore needs dealt with. So can be anywhere, like I said, depends a lot on your scale of production and what you're trying to produce, but anywhere from so little that it's basically out of sight, out of mind, all the way to the point of overwhelming to where you don't know where you're going to go with it, right? So, as a manager, it's important to try to decipher where you fit in that realm. So, if we're thinking through a little bit on that production side of things, so some of these numbers are maybe not 100% relevant in today's standard. So there's lots of different ways to grow livestock, and so this isn't a one size fits all. It doesn't mean that that 2-pound broiler is every one of them going to make 0.18 pounds per day of manure, right? So this is kind of a general overview, but we see anywhere from darn near 150 pounds a day from a 1,400-pound dairy cow down to under 0.2 of a pound per day. But we're not talking about the same scale on the size of the critters either, right? So makes more sense that the big critters are going to have more production. Maybe a bigger problem for us if we aren't ready or aren't set up to deal with that. But it may also be a good thing that we're getting more production, which can give us potentially more resource if we're looking at that manure as a resource that we can use for something else, right? So yeah, and the beef cow deal, 80 pounds per day. So I'm not sure that there's a lot of beef cattle that are only weighing 1,000 pounds anymore. So that may be higher, but like I said, this is just a kind of a general overview, and everybody's true production system and where you're at in the world will make a difference on what you are actually getting. So, but gives a relative relative aspect to how much manure you may have to deal with, right? So um, when we talk about how much manure there is, how much waste there is that we're going to have to deal with, that last slide showed units of pounds per animal per day, right? So if we're thinking about how we're going to deal with that, we need to be comparing apples to apples. So pounds per animal per day is not just equally equivalent to how many cubic feet per animal per day, right? So there's a conversion factor there. And we just need to know kind of what units we're working in. So if we're trying to communicate, or if we're trying to set up a system that meets our need, if what we're getting when we're thinking about how much production there's going to be is pounds per day from that beef cow. If we get pounds per day, then we can't just directly use those pounds per day to figure out how many cubic feet of volume we need in a storage, right? So again, I think hopefully fairly straightforward, but just something else to kind of keep in mind that as you are digging through resources on manure production, there's all over the board on how they get reported, right? So kind of makes sense that if we were thinking about some of the manures that get handled typically more as a liquid, those would maybe be in a more of a gallons per day, and some of the solids may be more cubic feet per day. So we even sometimes can report in bushels per animal per day, or per 100 animals per year, or any of those kind of terms. But some application equipment, some dry manure spreaders, they used to, a lot of them would get reported their size based on how many bushels they would hold. So a lot of times I think now they get reported either as bushels and cubic feet, or just cubic feet. But again, if we're looking at how big a spreader do I need, and we're thinking about how many pounds of manure we have, that's not a direct comparison to how many cubic feet. So we got to go through that conversion. The next piece of that puzzle that can be a big one is if we're adding manure to that manure, right? Or if we have a housing system or a production system where those critters are commingling their manure and bedding. So generally speaking, especially at a small farm scale, we're not separating the bedding from the manure. It all gets handled as a manure when we're dealing with it. So and that can add a significant volume to the manure that we're trying to deal with, right? So we're looking more as a resource, looking at the manure more as a resource. Kind of the old saying was, that's the smell of money, right? So subject interpretation, obviously, right? So the point, I think, was that it's not just a waste product. There's some value there. So in today's environment, I don't know that I hear that term or that saying as much, but we talk a lot about circularity and things being regenerative and sustainable and green. And if we're thinking about manure as a resource, that fits right into that arena. So using it as a resource is regenerative, and it's part of a piece to some sustainability and circular flow of nutrients, and using all the pieces of the puzzle on our small farms, right? So from that resource standpoint, what opportunities do we have for that manure? So the big one that has been prominent for throughout history is using the manure as a nutrient source for soil, using it as amendment for crop production, right? So the manure has some nutrients in it, and the crops that we're trying to grow need those nutrients. So it's worked well for decades, longer than that, to use that manure as a resource for crop production. So the second bullet point there, it can be a great feedstock for compost production too. So I'll hit on that a little bit more. But if we're thinking about it from a resource standpoint, and that's not necessarily exclusive of the soil amendment or crop nutrient source, but can be a separate arena also, right? So we can also use manure as a source of biogas production, and there's a lot of science and some art in that also. Those can be done on lots of different scales also, from truly from a small farm scale all the way up to very large complex anaerobic digesters to generate a biogas for energy needs and use it for heating and electric generation and lots of different things. So I don't know that that's generally speaking a big fit for the small farms arena, just because of how we typically handle the manures and the volume and those kind of things. But it can be a resource for that. So we also can use the manure to generate bedding. So this is done in dairy settings fairly often, maybe on a larger farm scale, because the equipment it takes to actually separate the liquid from the solids and be able to use that bedding. But that is a resource standpoint that you could take, as far as that manure has some value, can have some value as a bedding. Whether that fits for our small farm situation, there's lots of things that may need looked at to know whether or not that's applicable for us, right? But it is a potential resource. So and then the liquids, they may have a place in an irrigation system, right? So they're liquid, and in my part of the state, we've got some moisture since last fall, but it's been fairly dry the last couple of years. And if you had some liquid that you could use for crop production, that would have been a fantastic thing, right? So and maybe in our small farms area, depending on what type of livestock and the production system we have, this may fit better than in some of the larger farms. So if we have a fairly large, say, cattle pen that we're collecting the manure from, including the liquid, and we have a smaller crop production area, we would get more liquid per crop production area, if that makes sense. So water seems like it's something that there's a lot of when we're talking about how much is in manure. But then if we say would like to have some more water to spread on our crop production area, it seems like it doesn't go very far. So kind of two opposing forces there, but that liquid portion of the manure may have a place in an irrigation type system on a small farm. So another potential resource for us. So thinking through it as a resource, and kind of from that crop production standpoint, it's a natural fertilizer, right? So there's a reason that it's been used in that sense for a lot of years, and is still getting used in that sense today, right? So we talk about manure as a complete fertilizer. So that's kind of one side of the coin. It's a complete fertilizer, but it's not always a balanced fertilizer. And what I mean when I say that is it's a complete fertilizer in that it has, generally speaking, some of all of the macronutrients, right? And then some micronutrients and other stuff too. So macronutrients being nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are NPK. And then the micronutrients list can get long, but even down to it's got organic matter in it, right? So it's a complete fertilizer in that it's not just a source of nitrogen or just a source of zinc, but instead is a source of all of those nutrients. And of course, like we spoke before, what that makeup is and the breakdown of those is dependent on lots of factors. So, but it generally speaking has some of all of those nutrients in it. It's not always a balanced fertilizer in that it may not have those nutrients in the proportions that are appropriate for the crop that we're trying to grow, right? So it may have some nitrogen, some phosphorus, and some potassium, but it may be relatively higher in, say, phosphorus than nitrogen, whereas the crop that we're trying to grow may have a higher nitrogen need than phosphorus. So even though there's some of all those nutrients there, they don't necessarily match up exactly with what the crop would need. So again, depends on your specific manure and on the crop that you're trying to grow. But when those terms get thrown around, as we're talking through manure as a resource, that's what that means. Complete in that it has some of everything, but doesn't necessarily have it in the right proportions for our need. So this probably gets a little bit hard to read on the screen there. This information is, again, estimated values. Lots of things impact that. But if we look kind of down through the list there, lots of different critters, and then nitrogen, P2O5 equivalent, and then K2O. So our NP and our K are kind of listed out there in some values of what percentage of that manure from those critters would be those nutrients, right? So it certainly isn't like the manure is going to be 50% nutrients, which kind of makes sense if we think back through how much of that was water, right? So if a fairly significant amount of that manure is water, then the nutrient content is going to be some subset of what the solids fraction of that was usually. So another important thing that may be worth thinking about here, they have a column on salinity. So depending on your manure, and even if we're in a bedding type situation, those kind of things can have a fairly significant impact on the salinity of that manure, and that may be of importance to us depending on where we're using that manure on, say, a crop application, using it as a nutrient for crop application. So, or even if we're looking at it just as a waste product and we're spreading it somewhere, if we keep going back to the same place and applying, we could have an impact based on that salinity. So the last column there, excuse me. The last column there is a carbon to nitrogen ratio. So I'll touch a little bit more on composting, but that carbon to nitrogen ratio, and we may have some folks on that are more well versed in composting than I am even, but that carbon to nitrogen ratio becomes important if we're trying to actually compost that manure. So composting it's a science and an art for sure. So there's lots of different ways to try to achieve a goal of composting manure. I don't know how close anybody could read the numbers on that last slide, but lots of those manures are fairly short in having enough carbon to be able to compost just the manure itself, right? So if we stack up a manure, a lot of times it will probably break down to some extent. But if we think about if somebody would have, say, a manure that's mixed with a lot of bedding, either straw or corn stalk, corn stover based bedding, or wood chips, wood sawdust, those types of things that are a carbon source, those are a prime candidate to be able to compost, because we're adding some extra carbon and we're getting some nitrogen from that manure. So gives us a little bit more bulk a lot of times. Also, if we have some of those carbon sources in there and trying to compost, we want that process needs to be aerobic, so it needs oxygen to be able to compost. And if we have some of those bulkier carbon stocks in there, so say like a corn stover type bedding, sometimes that helps let the air flow through that stockpile that we're trying to compost also. If we don't have that that aerobic situation, we can get into some cases where we have more of a anaerobic type scenario, and that's where we get some odors and those kind of things that are not desirable from a composting standpoint. So something else that's worth noting, if we're truly composting, we get an elevated temperature from the biological processes that are happening as those critters, the little microbes, are doing their magic on the stuff in our compost pile there. So that is actually how we help reduce some pathogens in the manure and the other feedstock to that compost pile. That heating can be a slippery slope, so you can get in where the temperatures elevate to a point beyond where you'd like them to be too. So we kind of circle back a little bit here. So I didn't get super deep on lots of the specifics since there's such a wide variety in those manures, but the big thing is if we're circling back to our management standpoint, we need to look at what are we trying to actually accomplish, right? So do we just want rid of the waste product? Do we want the benefits? Some of both, again, is a reasonable answer. And then something else that I think I touched on, but just worth a little recap, is the manager has some responsibility to follow laws. So and just be a good steward of the resources that we have in addition to those laws. But in Iowa, there are some regulations for small farms. There are more regulations for larger farms. Our image website, the Iowa Manure Management Action Group website, is a fantastic resource for some of those types of things if we're trying to dig a little further on what some of those regulations may be. Also, the Iowa DNR Animal Feeding Operations website has lots of that information, and there's a lot of crossover between the image website and the Iowa DNR website also. But from the small farm standpoint, if we're thinking about confinement type critters, there's significant cutoff at 500 animal units. So if we were talking finishing beef cattle, that'd be 500 head. So different critters have different animal units, and those are defined by Iowa DNR for these rules. But just to kind of give you a sense, 500 head of finishing cattle is a pretty significant amount of critters in my standpoint. So a lot of our small farm scenarios wouldn't necessarily be at that level. Small farm or not, we're still obligated to not cause a water quality violation. So that's a big underlying rule for everyone. And then said 500 animal units on the confinement scenario. Pasture and open lot type things are different than that also. So I don't know that that in the small farm situation we'd have a tremendous amount of oversight, but everybody is to not cause a water quality violation. So thinking through our land application, if that's kind of where we end up out of our what's our goal, we need to know how much there's going to be to apply, and that's a little bit art to go with the science of trying to figure it out. And if you have an operation, you may have a good handle on what your specific situation is. Otherwise, you don't always know what Mother Nature is going to throw at you either for how much there's truly going to be. But thinking through and trying to get a handle on what that can be is important as we're thinking about how we're going to apply that. when we can apply it, because when we can apply it, it's going to have a direct effect on how much we need to store, right? So if we say only want to apply it in the spring or in the growing season, then we're going to have a more significant storage area to store that manure, versus if we're going to apply 3 times throughout the growing season and not generate any over the winter. What equipment do we have available to collect that manure, put it in storage, transport it, and spread it? Or what other options do we have to get someone with that equipment to help us deal with that manure is another big piece of our land application question, right? So if we think that that we're going to spread it on 40 acres and we don't have a means to be able to collect it and spread it, then that doesn't work so well. If what we have is a few rows of some produce production, it may be a lot more feasible to hand spread some of that manure, right? So everybody's situation is going to be different, but we got to kind of think through what options we have and how that may fit for our system. So something else that's worth noting, just because we want it to be used as a resource doesn't mean that we have to use it ourselves necessarily either, right? So there may be somebody somewhere that can get some good out of that resource besides ourselves at the farm level. There is some liability that goes with knowing what's in that manure if you're going to let somebody else use that or send it somewhere else. Some herbicides that may get used, especially in like a grass or pasture type situation, have some restrictions on those kind of things. And I'm not the expert to get into the details of that, but it's important to note that that sometimes there's some aspects that need thought through, and the labels on those type of products obviously need consulted to know what's okay and what's not okay. But there can be some carryover situations that could cause some harm to a crop production area if we haul manure from a pasture that had been treated to a crop production area. So the components of the manure, including the nutrients, are usually kind of what drives our land application. So whether we're trying to just get rid of the waste, we don't want to over apply the nutrients, or if we're trying to utilize that manure as a resource, we want to put on the right amount of nutrients, right? So if we put on excessive nutrients, that increases our level of risk for groundwater, surface water contamination with those nutrients. And not that will happen for sure, but it definitely increases the risk. So if we have a higher concentration of those nutrients, then we're opening up that risk to having those transported elsewhere. So how much is too much, and what will they be used for on those nutrients, right? So in order to know how much is too much, is kind of a two-piece of that puzzle. Soil tests do a lot for us to be able to know where we're at, and then what we're trying to grow and produce is another piece of what we need for those nutrients. So that's what will they actually be used for, right? So another important piece of the puzzle is what time we're going to apply those nutrients if we're talking about a land application scenario, right? So if we want those nutrients to stay where we can get the goodie out of them from a resource standpoint in a crop production area, or even if we're just trying to get rid of that waste, we need those nutrients to stay where we put them. So if we're applying in a frozen ground scenario, then again, we'd be at a higher risk to runoff, right? So just being cognizant as a manager of what risk we're incurring based on the timing. So if we're using those nutrients in a crop production standpoint, if we can have them there when the crop needs them, they're a lot there's a lot less risk of having them leave if they're tied up in crop production, basically. So I mentioned already, but soil sampling kind of is a pretty good tool to help on the nutrient side of how we may manage that manure, right? So if we have some soils that are already really high in phosphorus, if we have a high phosphorus manure, it may not be the best idea to keep applying that high phosphorus manure to a soil that's already high in phosphorus, right? So we're increasing that concentration and increasing our risk for having those nutrients run off-site or losing them otherwise. And that's aside from knowing that if we also somewhere else had a low phosphorus soil, we could get a lot better good out of using our high phosphorus manure in that low phosphorus soil area. So having that information is another really helpful tool from a management side of things of how we're going to actually balance that out. So lots of different resources on being able to get soil samples and manure samples and get those tested. Some of those you can find on the image website. So there's some labs and those kind of resources, and Extension Outreach has good information on getting soil samples and also on manure samples too. So uniform application is important. So if we don't have a good spread pattern, we'll call it, for how we're getting those nutrients applied, then we might have some spots that are high in concentration and some spots that are low in concentration. And again, twofold on that. If we have some spots that don't have very high concentration, our plants there aren't going to have access to those nutrients. And then our high concentration spots are going to be more prone to having some of those nutrients go off site, right? So thinking through a little bit on the front of direct application to consumer food products, direct consumer food products. So some different things to think about there on a manure standpoint. And this information comes from Manure Management for Small and Hobby Farms from the NERC, and is several years old now, but it's still good information, right? So we don't necessarily want to be applying fresh manure to those gardens for several different reasons, pathogens and those type of things. Would want it to be aged and maybe composted for that scenario. So also don't want to do that application immediately before harvest, which makes sense, I think, if we're thinking about the risk that's involved there with transport of some of those some of what we're applying directly to our direct consumer product, right? So another note there, yeah, pet manure is not necessarily a good thing to use in garden type scenarios either. So seems like maybe it would be, but there's a couple reasons listed there for why that might not be the best. Yes, kind of just try to recap a little bit. Pretty broad overview. It's hard to get into specifics without leaving somebody out or focusing too hard on one scenario versus another. But hopefully we covered a little bit about just kind of what is manure, right? Again, and then talk through as a manure manager, what does that really mean? We got some decisions to make. We have some responsibility, and also have some choices that can give us some freedom to use that manure to the best of our ability. So talk through a little bit about thinking about the manure as a waste product, some about as a resource or a co-product. Again, not one right, wrong, or the other. And a lot of times we're probably somewhere in that gray area in the middle. So kind of the take homes here, I guess, would be from a manure management standpoint on your small farm. I think the place to start is really truly, what is the objective? And then if we know what that objective is, if we have a little more information about how much manure we're going to have and what is that manure's composition, what's it made of, how do we handle it, solid, liquid, or what can we do to handle it with the equipment we have? then we can make a more informed, better decision about how we meet that objective that we have. So also, again, it's important to note as a manure manager that you have some responsibility in the handling of that manure for yourself and for to follow the rules and the laws and just be a good neighbor in general. So and the last point, I don't know that anybody doesn't already know this, but it's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it, and it can be pretty rewarding to use those manure nutrients, or even just to get rid of our waste and not have it be in our way anymore. Is that's a we met our objective if that was our objective, right? So I think I may have used all my time plus a minute or two, but thank you for your time tonight. I appreciate it, and was fun to get a partake in the series. So thanks, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Tony. Are there any questions? I didn't see any in the chat, but I thought I would open it up just in case. You guys are feel free to unmute, or if you want to enter a question in the chat, we can definitely get that answered before we send you on. I did enter some resources. So the University of Wisconsin will test your manure if you're interested. I also found a really good resource from the University of Minnesota that talks about sampling different kinds of manure. And then they also have a list of places, testing laboratories that will test your manure from all over the United States. So that kind of gives you more choice than just the University of Wisconsin. I just happen to know them. And then I also included Utah State had a really great soil composting or soil amendment section in their advanced soil fertility video that they had, and I put a link to that in the chat as well. She talks a little bit about like what happens when you use 6 inches of chicken manure every single year on your garden, that's not really something that is going to improve your garden. It's actually going to be detrimental. So I found that really interesting and really helpful, especially as someone who probably has put 6 inches of chicken manure on her garden bed. So all right. If there's no questions, I'll let you guys go, and we will see you next month. Next month is our small ruminant webinar where we talk about starting your flock. So we'll talk about different breeds of sheep and things to consider when deciding a breed and purchasing your first animals. I hope you guys have a great night.